The Nile shimmered beneath the morning sun, casting golden light across the colossal temples of Thebes. Between the towering sandstone columns, slaves moved like shadows, carrying stone blocks heavier than their own bodies. The air buzzed with the rhythm of chisels chanced to Ra and the muffled cries of those who faltered. In the days of Pharaoh Setepkare, power was worshipped as divine will. Every breath, every task, every life belonged to him, the living god of Egypt. His empire stretched from the delta to the deserts beyond Nubia, built on blood, sweat, and obedience. Beneath his gaze, the workers were nothing more than offerings to eternity. Among them was a young slave named Menen, captured during a border raid and branded with the mark of the falcon god. His back bore the scars of a dozen lashes, each one a reminder that mercy had no place in Pharaoh's kingdom. Yet Menen's heart still burned quietly with rebellion. He dreamed not of riches or freedom, but of peace, a life without the whip's hiss. The punishment for disobedience was written in blood across Egypt's history. Floggings were not merely tools of pain, they were acts of worship to the gods of order. The overseers, known as the Eyes of Horus, carried braided whips tipped with bronze hooks, said to symbolize the claws of divine justice. Each strike, they claimed, purified the soul of corruption. Temple inscriptions glorified these punishments as sacred rituals. "The flesh bends, but the soul endures," read one engraving at Karnak. Yet for the slaves who endured them, the rituals were nothing more than cruelty cloaked in religion. Beneath the carved walls of gods and kings, men were broken in the name of eternity. Pharaoh Setepkare's obsession with immortality had reached fevered heights. He believed that each stroke of the whip upon the flesh of a slave strengthened his own spirit in the afterlife. The screams that echoed through the courtyards became music to his priests, who declared that such suffering pleased the sun god Ra. The braided whips themselves were masterpieces of torment. Made from camel hide and crocodile skin, they were woven with barbed ends of copper or sharpened bone. Some bore small beads soaked in oil and resin, making them crack louder upon flesh, a sound designed to terrify as much as to wound. Menen had witnessed countless floggings in his years at the temple quarries, men accused of stealing grain, speaking out of turn, or failing to move a block quickly enough were dragged before the overseers. They were tied to pillars beneath the sacred hieroglyphs of justice as priests watched with serene detachment. But on one scorching afternoon, a punishment unlike any before took place. A group of workers had been accused of desecrating a tomb, a crime punishable by death. Among them was Menen's closest friend, Pharaoh, a man of laughter and loyalty. The priests claimed he had stolen a gold amulet from a sealed chamber, an accusation that would soon unleash the wrath of Pharaoh's enforcers. The trial was swift and silent. The accused were not allowed to speak. They were stripped, bound, and paraded through the temple courtyard. Whispers spread among the slaves. Some said Pharaoh was innocent. Others said he had merely touched the relic out of curiosity. None of it mattered. The sentence had already been carved into stone. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the statues of Osiris, the whips were prepared. The overseers soaked them in oil mixed with sand and bits of metal, claiming it would make them bite deeper. Pharaoh himself ordered that the flogging be performed before the priests and nobles, a spectacle of divine justice. Menen watched from the shadows, trembling. He knew that in Egypt, truth bowed before fear. The priests raised their hands in blessing, and the first lash fell. The sound echoed through the courtyard like thunder, a wet crack that silenced even the cicadas. Pharaoh's cry pierced the evening air, a sound that would haunt Menen for the rest of his life. As the punishment continued, Menen clenched his fists. The sight of his friend's flesh tearing beneath the braided leather ignited something dangerous in his heart. He knew the gods Pharaoh worshipped were not merciful, but he began to wonder if any god worthy of devotion could allow such cruelty. The priest spoke of order, but what Menen saw was madness. Each blow seemed to strip not just flesh, but humanity itself. By the time the moon rose above the temple gates, Pharaoh no longer screamed. He only trembled like a dying flame. The overseer wiped the blood from his whip and bowed before the pharaoh, who smiled beneath his jeweled headdress. That night, as torches burned low, Menen crept near the courtyard wall. The stones were stained dark, glistening under the torchlight. He touched the cold, wet ground where his friend had fallen and whispered a promise only the dead could hear. The gods of Egypt might have turned away, but Menen would not. From that moment on, something shifted in him. The fear that once bound him began to rot away, replaced by a dangerous certainty. He began to watch, to listen, to learn. Among the slaves and workers, whispers of discontent flickered like hidden flames. Some spoke of rebellion, others spoke of vengeance, and somewhere deep within the temple walls, beneath the painted eyes of Horus and Anubis, Menen began to plan. The whip had ruled Egypt for centuries, but one day he swore it would fall silent. The dawn rose red over the Nile the next morning, as if the river itself bled for the innocent. The priests called it a blessing from Ra. Menen called it a warning. The whips had sung their song of pain for too long, and soon Egypt would hear another sound, the sound of reckoning. The morning began with the scent of burning incense drifting through the vast temple corridors. Sunlight poured through narrow slits in the stone walls, cutting across the dust and mist like divine spears. The priests walked in solemn processions, their linen robes whispering against the floor. But beneath that sacred calm lay something darker. The day's punishments were about to begin. Pharaoh Setepkare had decreed that the flogging court would serve as both a spectacle and a warning. Beneath the massive statues of Horus and Ra, prisoners were brought in chains to face judgment. It was said that every lash of the whip was seen by the gods themselves, that through pain, order was maintained. But for those who stood beneath the lash, the gods felt very far away. Menen, now a stone hauler in his 6th year of servitude, had become one of the silent witnesses to these punishments. The overseers trusted him for his obedience, never knowing the storm that brewed behind his quiet eyes. When the horn sounded that morning, summoning the slaves to gather in the courtyard, Menen's hands trembled, not from fear, but from fury he could no longer bury. In the center of the courtyard stood the pillars of truth, 2 massive columns where the condemned were tied. The priests called it a holy place, but to the workers it was a place of screams. The air there always smelled of sweat, copper, and dust, of blood dried into the cracks of stone. The first prisoner dragged into the light was a young woman named Neferu, a scribe's assistant accused of concealing stolen papyrus scrolls. Menen recognized her faintly. She was gentle, always sharing her bread with the weaker workers. Her cries as the guards bound her wrists echoed off the temple walls like prayers gone unanswered. The executioner that day was a man called Horem, the Pharaoh's chosen punisher. His arms were thick as carved granite, his face emotionless. The braided whip in his hand gleamed with oil, its barbed ends tipped with metal. Each strand was said to have been blessed by the priests, so that its bite would purify the unworthy. "May Ra see your suffering and cleanse your soul," the high priest declared, his voice booming through the courtyard. The crowd of workers fell silent. The whip rose high, catching the light, and fell with a sound like tearing cloth. Neferu's body jerked with the blow. The second strike tore through her linen dress. By the 5th, her back was a river of crimson. Menen's chest tightened as he watched her body bend under the blows, her cries growing hoarse until they became breathless whimpers. The overseers called out the count of lashes, 20, 30, 50. The priests nodded with approval at each one, murmuring hymns to the gods. The flogging was meant to teach obedience, but what it truly bred was hatred. The slaves' eyes followed every lash, their silence heavy with rage. Menen's fists clenched until blood welled beneath his nails. He wanted to look away, but to turn from her suffering felt like betrayal. By the time the punishment ended, Neferu was motionless, her back carved with lines that looked almost like hieroglyphs of pain. Horem dropped his whip to the ground, its barbs dripping with blood, and turned to bow before the pharaoh's seat. But Setepkare did not even blink. He watched with the same calm detachment one might show to the rising of the sun. Next came the punishment of the tomb thieves, the same accusation that had claimed Pahiti's life weeks before. 3 men were dragged before the court, their faces hollow from days without food. They were accused of entering a sacred burial chamber, stealing amulets meant for the afterlife. No proof was presented and none was needed. In the eyes of Pharaoh, accusation was guilt enough. This time, the flogging would not end at 50 lashes. The high priest announced that the thieves would be purified until their bodies surrendered their sins. It meant they would be beaten until death claimed them. Menen's heart thundered as he watched the first man tied to the pillar. The whip whistled through the air, slicing flesh with every strike. The victim screamed until his voice broke, then fell silent as his knees gave out. Blood sprayed the stone with each lash, and soon he was still. The second thief begged for mercy, promising to reveal treasures hidden in the desert. But the priests only smiled. Such pleas were part of the ritual. The whip fell again and again, barbs tearing into his ribs, his arms, his spine. His body shuddered like a reed in the wind until it no longer moved. The third man was silent even as they tied him. He did not beg or cry. When the first lash fell, he looked toward the sky and whispered something that Menen could not hear. By the 20th strike, his back was a ruin of flesh. By the 30th, he no longer breathed. The overseers wiped their whips clean in ritual bowls of oil and incense, declaring that the gods were pleased. The priests anointed the pharaoh with sacred oils, proclaiming him the guardian of order. And yet, beneath that triumph, a different sound lingered. A quiet murmur among the slaves, the sound of souls that had begun to awaken. That night, Menen returned to his quarters in silence. The walls were thin. Through them, he could hear the faint sobs of the workers who had watched the punishments. The moonlight spilling through the window fell across his arms, tracing old scars that never truly healed. He reached for a broken piece of stone he had hidden beneath his sleeping mat. Slowly, he began to carve something into it, not hieroglyphs, but symbols of his own making. Each mark represented a life taken, a friend lost, a scream he could not forget. When he finished, he looked down at what he had created. It was the shape of a whip, cut in half. The next morning, whispers spread again through the camps. A rumor that a slave had spoken of defiance near the riverbanks. Menen knew the risk of even thinking such thoughts, but he no longer cared. The gods of Egypt demanded blood, but he was ready to give them fire. And as the sun rose over the temple spires, gilding the stone in light that looked almost like flame, the overseers prepared for another day of punishment. They did not know that among the chained, one man's soul had already broken free. The whips would crack again and again, but soon they would strike against something far stronger than flesh, against the will of a man who had nothing left to lose. The dawn broke red and heavy, as though the sun itself bled across the Nile. The temples gleamed gold beneath its light, yet the ground beneath them trembled with unease. The air was thick with whispers, rumors of missing overseers, broken chains, and slaves who had vanished into the desert night. Pharaoh Setepkare sat upon his alabaster throne, his eyes burning with suspicion. Reports of unrest had reached him, carried by trembling priests who swore that the workers spoke of rebellion. "Impossible," the pharaoh hissed. "They fear the whip more than they fear death. But fear once broken cannot be remade." Menen stood among the quarry workers that morning, his body marked by scars but his gaze unbroken. In the weeks since the last flogging, he had quietly gathered those who shared his fury. They were men and women who had lost everything, families taken, backs torn, spirits crushed. Now they had only one thing left: vengeance. At dusk, when the overseer's chants faded and the torches were lit along the temple walls, Menen made his move. The slaves worked in silence, but each carried a secret weapon: stone fragments sharpened to points, wooden rods stolen from the scaffolds, and lengths of rope twisted into garrots. The tools of labor had become the tools of war. Inside the courtyard, the pillars of truth loomed like ghosts, stained forever with blood. Tonight, they would bear witness not to punishment, but to justice. Menen's eyes fixed upon the largest statue, the towering image of Ra, the sun god, beneath whose shadow Pharaoh had condemned countless souls. "Let him see," Menen whispered. "Let him watch what his servants have done." The first blow fell not from a whip, but from a hammer. One of the slaves, old Khepri, swung it into the skull of an unsuspecting overseer. The crack of bone was followed by silence, then chaos. Cries erupted as torches were overturned, flames leaping to the walls. The temple courtyard exploded into violence. Menen seized Horem, the executioner, before he could draw his whip. The same braided weapon that had torn Pahiti's flesh now hung limp in Menen's hands. "You remember this, don't you?" Menen snarled. Horem tried to speak, but Menen's rage gave him no breath to answer. With one strike, he turned the whip against its master. Each lash tore at the man's flesh, each snap echoing like a ghostly chorus of every scream that had ever filled that courtyard. The slaves moved like a storm. They tore down the banners of Ra, smashed the idols of gold, and dragged the priests into the sand. "Where are your gods now?" someone shouted. The priests wept, calling upon divine mercy that had never been shown to their victims. Menen did not look back. He was already climbing the temple steps. There, beneath the blazing torches, Pharaoh Setepkare stood surrounded by his guards. His jeweled headdress glimmered, but his hands trembled. "You dare raise your hand against the divine?" he bellowed. Menen stepped forward, his chest heaving, blood streaking his face. "Divine," he spat. "You are no god. You are a man who hides behind pain." The guards lunged, but the slaves surged forward in a roar. Stone met steel, blood met sand. When the battle ended, only Menen and the pharaoh remained standing. Around them, the temple burned. Statues cracked and toppled, their stone faces crumbling into dust. Menen raised the barbed whip, Setepkare's own symbol of power. The pharaoh's eyes widened as Menen threw it into the fire. The leather curled and hissed, the barbs glowing red as the flames devoured them. "No more whips," Menen said softly. "No more gods who feed on suffering." The pharaoh staggered backward, choking on smoke. The fire caught his robes, and within moments the god-king of Egypt was consumed by the very flames that had devoured his victims. His screams were carried into the night like the final hymn of a dying empire. When dawn came again, the temple was nothing but ash. The pillars had fallen. The statues lay in ruin. The Nile flowed quietly nearby, reflecting a sky washed clean of fire. Menen stood upon the ruins, his body weak, but his spirit unbroken. Around him the freed slaves knelt, not in worship, but in silence. For the first time in generations, no whip cracked in the morning air. The sound that filled Egypt that day was the river's song, calm and endless. Menen looked to the horizon, where the sun rose once more, no longer a god to be feared, but a light to be followed. And so ended the reign of the Braided Whips. Beneath the ruins of the pharaoh's court, the sands of Egypt covered the bones of tyranny. Yet the story of that night lived on, passed through whispers and songs, a warning to all who believed power could be kept by pain.